I've been reading visual novels for over 10 years now. At this point, I've read 101 visual novels that I feel comfortable ranking. In this video, I'm going to rank them from worst to best by tiers. This is mostly going to be my opinion, quote-unquote objectivity kept to a minimum. Starting with the F tier, basically my least favorite visual novels by far. Sayo Uda had an interesting premise with Edge, but it was way too over the top for me to take anything seriously. Kanocho to Ore to Koibito to starting with an early relationship was nice, but it added way too many obnoxious harem comedy traits that made me rage quit. Dare Soda is the perfect example of episodic grifts. Don't half-ass episodic release stories. People are going to notice. Next up, we have E tier. E tier is mostly stuff I kinda dislike or just don't really care about at all. Narcissu should have been feelsy, but gave me no time to care for the characters, and the overall presentation was boring and meh. Brass Restoration might have been good if the main character wasn't a douche most of the time. I couldn't even finish the first route. Dracu-Riot was just weird and confusing, and not in a good way. X-Blaze Code Embryo was nice to see the origins of S and Blaze Blue, but the MC was obnoxiously whiny, and the story was incredibly forgettable. The Melody of Grisaya was just another Grisaya spinoff, with a kinda meh rich girl Yuji got to attract, I guess. Canvas 2 was every mediocre moege trope rolled into one, as well as some stupid teacher-student romance. I don't think Colonel Sanders is quite as bad as some people say, but the comedy was still pretty damn cringe. Next up, we have D tier. D tier is stuff I consider okay at best, or just pretty disappointing. Nekopara Volume 2 had my least favorite cat-girl duo, and ultimately had the same shallow writing as most of them. I was honored to be featured in the R Visual Novels visual novel, but it was mostly just a bunch of meh inside jokes. Alma Iro Islenauts had a really good character in Shirley, but unfortunately, I disliked just about everything else, especially the humor. The Leisure of Grisaya was a short spin-off with some of the funny comedy, not really much else. Dracu-Riot had a cool setting, and Eleno was nice and all, but every other route was just disappointing, especially the overuse of Yuzusoft's protagonist pervert-shaming humor. X-Blaze Lost Memories was an upgrade over the original, since it had some decent feels, but ultimately, it was still shallow and forgettable. The Afterglow of Grisaya was a kinda nice spin-off with more Asako screen time, but not really much else. Nekopara Volume 1 had an okay enough cat-girl duo, but ultimately was just a shallow cat-girl fanservice VN. Nekopara Volume 0 was a little better than 1 due to being a prequel with group interactions, but still pretty shallow. I only read the sequel routes and side stories in the Labyrinth of Grisaya since I watched the anime of that, and I guess those side stories were kinda nice. I.O. had the potential to be so much better, but ultimately just became way too overly complex for its own good. Shinigami no Kiss is a kind of okay Nakige with one of my least favorite tsundere little sister characters ever. Shakuro-san no Junai Road was a kind of funny spin-off, but just felt lacking compared to most Majikoi entries. Edelweiss, Aiden Fantasia had the two best girls, yet somehow had a meh and a lame route respectively. Crescendo had some interesting and unique melodrama, but the route quality was a bit too inconsistent for me. Dies Irae had potential to be something great, but just had way too much obnoxious chuny dialogue, especially by the villains. Princess Evangel W Happiness was just another moege fandisk, and didn't really do much special with any of the sequel routes, or in the new routes for that matter. Kira Kira was mostly mediocre with a lame cross-dressing gimmick, but the true routes were great enough to make it kinda worth reading. Next up we have C tier. C tier is basically the decent but nothing special, or mid tier. Fashioning Little Miss Lonesome was the only otomege I finished, mostly since I liked the comedy. Everything else was okay at best. Never 7 is a weird adult-age slice-of-life romance with only a little bit of the Infinity series mystery stuff in the late parts of the visual novel. Planetarian is a kinda nice intro to key drama, but its short length and lack of characters limits its personal appeal to me. Nekopara Volume 3 is only this high cause Cinnamon is easily my favorite cat girl, otherwise it's about as shallow as the others. Eden is a decent enough Nakige with a pretty predictable ending. Muv-Luv Extra was mostly pretty lame, but Unlimited was decent enough to make the overall package fine enough. Komyu is a plot visual novel with an interesting setting, but heavily inconsistent route and character quality. Nekopara Volume 4 actually develops the main character for once, but ultimately it's still a harem cat-girl simulator. Koisuru Natsu no Last Resort was a decent enough moege in a summer resort, but Umi was kind of annoying outside her route. The Tototo and Koirizo fandisk was a decent fandisk for both series, especially since the Tototo characters were actually likable for once. Majito was pretty funny to me on a personal level, since it was actually a bunch of inside jokes I got since I'm pretty active in the Majikoi and Minato fans Discord. Senran Banka had a decent setting, decent characters, and a few good routes, but ultimately wasn't anything that special. Rewrite Cradle's Tale was a kinda interesting epilogue to the main series, but a bit too short for my liking. Ultimate Boob Wars is a Nukige, but I thought the hilarious setting and the comedy was generally good enough to carry it. The Futuraba mini fan discs were very short sequel routes, but had most of what made the original Futuraba good. Machiko A2 had most of the appeal of the series, but just had my overall least favorite set of routes in A. Kikokugai was a pretty edgy action drama visual novel, but it had an ending that was unintentionally hilarious to me. You and Me and Her, otherwise known as Totono, was a pretty well done take on meta elements in a visual novel, but I hated some of the edgy moments, especially the NTR. Cross Channel is a good example of purposefully unlikable characters being both interesting and frustrating to get through. Muv-Luv Alternative has some of the best emotional moments in any visual novel, but also some incredibly frustrating info dumps and pacing issues. The original Doki Doki Literature Club was a bit too gimmicky for my taste, but I actually quite liked the wholesome side stories in DDLC+. Next we have B tier. B tier is mostly just solid visual novels that I enjoyed reading. I only read the Clannad routes and content that didn't appear in the anime adaptation, and they were pretty good. The Yuki Yuna visual novel was just all slice of life similar to the early anime adaptation, and it was pretty enjoyable. The original Edelweiss's comic art actually had some really good humor and surprisingly good wholesome moments, but the heroine routes were mostly meh. I only read the prologue in Eden of Grisaya, but had some surprisingly wholesome stuff that I wish was in the original Grisaya's common route. Futuraba is a pretty solid comedy-focused moege with some decent heroines, but with a pretty weird choice system. The Rewrite Idol side story felt like a pretty good extension of the common route with similar-ish comedy. Chihiro Himukai was a pretty wholesome one-heroine visual novel with the same writer as a bunch of the SME visual novels. Princess Evangel was a bit predictable and frustrating at times, but had some nice romance, and being able to relate to Catholic schools was unique for me. Hoshizora no Memoria had some pretty frustrating repetitive comedy, but actually had some solid drama in almost every route, especially the true one. Swan got pretty dark and depressing, but I thought the way it explored the characters was pretty interesting. Riddle Joker's Mayu and her route was so good that I could just not bring myself to care to read the rest of the mediocrity that was the rest of the visual novel. G-senjou no Mao was inconsistent at times, but ultimately had pretty well done drama. The Fruit of Grisaya could have done pacing a lot better, but the characters, comedy, and drama were still good regardless. Under One Wing was a comfy mix of slice-of-life romance and fighter plane tournament action. Karawa Shoujo is probably a bit dated now, but it's many people's first visual novel for a reason. It does some things better than Japanese visual novels in my opinion. Root Double was a pretty good mystery thriller that does most things well, but just didn't stick out as much as some of my favorites in the mystery genre. Wanko to Kuraso is an odd mix of comfy slice of life, feelsy melodrama, and a lot of H-scenes, yet it somehow works. Aokana was a pretty cool way to mix shonen sports into the moege genre. Almost everyone was likable. The original Tsukihime was a pretty interesting vampire fighting story with some memorable plot twists. Magical A4 only had 2 routes, but I actually thought both of them were surprisingly good. Sujiro has some problems like a wussy-ass main character, but the delinquent girl setting was interesting, and Ayumi is the best side character ever. Baldur's Sky Dive 1 was a pretty good introduction to the world, but it was a bit slow, repetitive, and edgy at times. Meteor World Actor is a great mystery VN with fun banter, but unfortunately, none of the routes have fully complete endings. Umineko episodes 1 through 4 was way too slow at times, but the setup for everything was pretty good. Umineko Chiru was a bit better paced, but I wasn't a fan of the ending. Umineko as a series easily has the best overall soundtrack and visual novels though. Musicus was a nice and fairly mature take on the band music world with some fun characters and interesting insightful themes. Shana no Kuni's fan disc was a kinda interesting Hozuki backstory mixed in with some solid wholesome sequel routes. Yume Miru Kusuri was a very solid psychological drama visual novel, albeit I definitely preferred Ayaka's route much more over the other two. Full Metal Daemon Muramasa got way too edgy for my taste a bunch of times, but had some nice insightful themes and some interesting action. Majikoi A3 is probably the most consistent A visual novel. I quite liked all 3 routes. Sabbath of the Witch had some cases of annoying humor that caused me to temporarily rage quit, but it easily has the best done drama in Ubisoft to date. Rewrite is a bit slow-paced and inconsistent in route quality, but has a pretty solid setting, character development, and some unique twists. Aokana Extra 1 has some of the most wholesome content I've seen in any visual novel. It's pretty crazy how much better Mashiro is in this and her original route compared to the rest of Aokana. Majikoi A1 has some of the more unique routes in the whole series alongside 2 other solid routes. Sankaku Renai has some of the best comedy in all visual novels I've read. Unfortunately, the actual romance is just serviceable, and I'm not a fan of the incest. D2 vs. Deer Drops is a great fan disc mixing solid casts of 2 visual novels, just a shame it's quite short. The original Deer Drops is a fun, light-hearted visual novel about the band life with some occasional good drama. Baldur's Sky Dive 2 is a slow start, but the rest of the visual novel is quite explosive plot-wise in the best way. Next up, we have A tier. These are visual novels I really like or consider one of my favorites. Fate Stay Night is a classic for a reason. A solid world with solid characters and well done character interactions and team-ups in a survival plot scenario. If My Heart Had Wings Flight Diary had a few really great sequel routes that carried it, since most of the rest of the routes were decent good at best. Making Lovers is the perfect example of how to do an adult age moe correctly. Have every character be likable, have all the routes be solid, and have a mix of hilarious comedy and surprising maturity fitting of adults. Symphonic Rain has some of my favorite plot twists in any visual novel, and is generally a pretty consistent good slice-of-life romance drama story. A Sky Full of Stars, or Miyazora, has one of the best examples of pure wholesome, brought down a little bit by silly melodrama in a couple routes. Shada no Kuni had an amazing first 3 chapters full of unexpected, really solid drama and character development, followed by 2 chapters that were kinda disappointing to me. Remember 11 is one of the best sci-fi mystery visual novels in terms of pacing and crazy reveals. The ending was unfortunate given how much was built up to that point though. Majikoi S is one of my favorite fan discs, taking the original and just adding a crap load of content and updated UI and music. A bunch of the routes were on the shorter side, but all of the charm of the original was still there, and all the variety of good options is unmatched. Ever 17 was my first foray into the sci-fi mystery genre, and I still hold it in mostly high regard. The build-up in every route was excellent, and there's some really good feels. Sadly, I was heavily disappointed with the execution of the ending. Bokuchin has some issues with scenes having way too much edge, but it otherwise has a lot of excellent character development, and quite possibly my favorite con route in any visual novel. Miyazora Fine Days is one of my all-time favorite fan discs. I quite liked every single route, continuing the wholesomeness of the original with almost none of the flaws of the original and some routes that I liked a lot more than I expected to. And now we have S tier. One of these would probably be my number 1 favorite visual novel in an alternate universe where my current number 1 doesn't exist. Miyazora Interstellar Focus is the perfect fan disc for me. It took my main issue with the original, made the perfect threesome route actually work really well, and had all the wholesomeness of the original while still giving some love to some side characters. If My Heart Had Wings, or Konosora, is the perfect intro into wholesome visual novels. It has a unique enough setting, good characters, fun interactions, and excellent endings for every single route, though it probably helps that I did QC testing for the retranslation. And finally, we have the double S tier. This has easily been my number 1 favorite visual novel in a long time, and nothing has even come close to its quality over the years. The original Majikoi just has everything I want in a visual novel. Excellent friendship themes, very good characters, decent development in the routes, great unique comedy, solid girls and bro characters, and a surprising amount of wholesome and awesome moments. And that is it for my 101 visual novel tier list. If you have any feedback or questions about this list, or you want to share some opinions of your favorite and least favorite visual novels, feel free to leave a comment below in this video.